I'm sure many of you know Marianne. She's the professor at the School of Information at San Jose State University. She's an amazing presenter and has written a couple of books, one of which I have got on my must-get list of girls in libraries. So thank you, and take it away, Marianne.
Okay, welcome. A couple of housekeeping issues first. That is, we are live streaming this, which I just realized is making me a little nervous. Literally just had that moment where I was like, oh my gosh. Anyways, we are live streaming this just so you are aware that that is happening. And so I just wanted to let you guys know that that's up. The second thing is that you're not going to necessarily walk away with something that you can like immediately take back to your school and do something with, because my goal for this session is that you walk away with questions, not answers. So, you know, that's generally the way I do business. You should probably be aware of that. Some of you may know that already. But just, you know, heads up, if you're like after something, you're probably going to walk away with something, but not practical. Like, this is not a practical session. So, and then the third housekeeping thing is I tried to play with the lights a little bit to see if that could pop up clearer. And it can't, but I'll give you my contact information at the end of the session. Since that white is really hard to read, I understand that. So right after the 2016 election, about the time I picked myself up off the floor, I had a really bad week that week, and Donald Trump's election was the least of it. I read something by Dana Boyd, who is a hero of mine, and she is a media literacy and internet researcher with youth, and she does really great, amazing work. And I read something by her where she was talking about the outcome of the 2016 election in regards to the propaganda and the actual fake news that was spread via social media during the election. I think we know more about it now, right, in 2019 than we did in 2017, but she was talking about that, and what was happening in the media literacy world was that everybody was like, well, our solution to this is to do more media literacy. And she was like, you know, I'm not so sure that's the solution, because one of the things that was coming out is she was going into schools and they were scattershot, one-shotting, half-assing, literally, media literacy instruction, and she said basically what it looked like was teachers telling their kids not to use Wikipedia. And I was like, oh, that sounds really familiar, right? That sounds a lot like some of the problems that we have with information literacy. And the other push, so while Dana was playing in that field, I play in this field, right? And I was looking at one of the solutions was we need to do more information literacy. And I, for a long time, for the last 10 years, have been struggling with the concept of information literacy for a couple of different reasons that we're going to get into in this session. And so it spoke to me. Dana, I was like, you and I, we're kind of thinking the same things. She's much smarter and she talks a lot and she goes around. She did a keynote session at South by Southwest last year during the Education Summit. So if you want to see what she's talking about, what I'm talking about, that, go Google Dana's keynote session from South by Southwest, SXSW, and you'll see what's going on there. So I thought we would spend some time revisiting what we mean by information literacy, because I think that that's a really important concept in terms of what we're doing in our school libraries when we're teaching research. It's okay. No. So information literacy has been around for a really long time, much longer than this. But really, we kind of trace our standards movements around information literacy back to a presidential report that came out of ALA in 1989. And in that, they defined information literacy as a set of abilities requiring individuals to recognize when information is needed, have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the need for information. That hasn't changed. That's still kind of the definition of information literacy. We've made it difficult. We've added standards, we've added threshold concepts, we've added benchmarks, we've done all of this thing, but it's still basically this, right? In terms of information literacy. They went on to say something that was really key, and I wish that this was much more of the kind of focus of what that is in terms of the definition, which is an information literate person is someone who's learned how to learn, right? And that, I think, is a really key notion, that what we really mean by information literacy is that you've learned how to learn. But I really want to break this down because there's some assumptions in information literacy that we don't always address very well. And I think it's really important that we start addressing those concepts because we can't move forward with our students, with the adults in our lives. Recent study, older people much more likely to believe fake news and propaganda than teenagers. I have a thought on why that is, but that's recent. So it's not just our kids. We need to give them some credit because they're better than the media and other adults in the world like to think they are. We know they are because we work with them. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about, both in terms of information, because that's really important, and also in terms of literacy. So some of you may recognize this. It's this sort of knowledge pyramid of the way things work, which is you start with data, uninterpreted, just simple pieces, bits and bytes, right? That's data. When that is interpreted and put into something, it becomes information. When you apply information, it's knowledge. And when you use that knowledge ethically, note that word, when you use that knowledge ethically, it's wisdom. We can debate what ethically means, I think is the problem. But here's the biggest thing that we have to deal with information, which is what is truth. Is information objective? Because in information literacy, the way we used to talk about it, information was objective. But anything is informing, right? The temperature outside is informing. How I emotionally respond to something is informing. But we don't necessarily think about that when we're talking about information literacy and breaking down information in that way. We think about it more as like the bits and bytes interpreted. And we don't even talk to the elephant. If I don't, please remind me. So let's problematize information. It's easy to do that, right? So we can make fun of this statement, I have a gut and my gut tells me more than anybody else's brain can ever tell me. But the truth of that is true. All right, I might not like what his gut, this was about global warming, so I may not like what his gut is telling him about climate change, but at the same time, this is true. It's people believe information that confirms what they believe. It's confirmation bias. We know this. And if we give them conflicting information, they discard it. They don't take it in and turn it into knowledge or wisdom. They're like, nope, I don't believe that, so I'm just going to think that that's just an alternative fact, right? Or something along those lines. So we have this sort of situation where when we're dealing with kids and we're teaching them to evaluate information and how that works, we also have to deal with their confirmation bias. It's not simply like, this source is trustworthy, because it doesn't matter how trustworthy and how much authority that source you think has. They still have confirmation bias in place. So that's the first thing, right? If information is subjective because of confirmation bias, we have to deal with that too. Can't just, it's not simple, right? So it's messy. There's some other things about that. It's not just confirmation bias, and it's not just politics. So this is going to be really political, by the way. But we also have misperceptions based on what we see in the world. So the most common misperception in undergraduate physics classrooms is that if you drop in a vacuum, if you drop a hammer and a feather, they're going to hit the floor. The hammer's going to hit the floor first because of mass. We've known since Galileo that that's not true. We proved it on the moon landing when they dropped a little geology hammer and something else that was like as light as a feather. It's air resistance. That's what makes the hammer hit first, it's not, if you're in a vacuum, they're going to hit at the same time. But when we watch the world around us, air's invisible. You don't see it. And so we have a misperception. So you have to undo misperceptions, even around things that we know since Galileo are not true, right? So you have to undo that. And that is a really tough concept to undo with physics students. My husband's a physics teacher, so we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. We also have interpretation. So let's start with something, like I said, this is going to be very political. My father-in-law will tell you, he will swear up and down that Fox News is fair and balanced. I can show him Media Matters reports and Columbia School of Journalism reports over and over and over again, and it will not matter. Because his interpretation of what they're saying on the news is what he believes. So he's interpreting information his way, and therefore Fox News is fair and balanced. We also have this lovely thing that happens in our world, especially when we're relying on media to give us information, which is both sidesism. Both sidesism had a lot to do with the 2016 election. And that's where you're trying, I wish that I could have turned off those lights because those tweets are hilarious, but that's where you are responsible to give a non-biased approach. But the problem with that is that tends to ignore context, right? So both sidesism, recently we had a big government shutdown, right? It was big news, it was everywhere. And AP Fact Check came out and they did this. They corrected this tweet, by the way. They had to respond to it because it got so big. Democrats put the blame for the shutdown on Trump, but it takes two to tango. Trump's demand for the $5.7 billion for his border wall is one reason for the budget impasse. The Democrats' refusal to approve the money is another one. This came out after he gave his televised speech, so sometimes in January, right? It's true. There's not a single thing in that headline that is wrong. It ignores that they had a budget deal in place with a Republican Congress and a Republican president, and he put the brakes on it. It ignores that particular context. It ignores that they had a secondary deal in place, and he wouldn't even talk about it because it wasn't the $5 million he wanted. Or billion, sorry, he wanted. It wasn't the $5.7 billion he wanted. So it ignores context. Twitter. I love Twitter when I'm watching the news. It's how I watched the State of the Union the other night because it's just much more entertaining to me. They just came for it. They came for AP. That's what they do, right? Pointing out the problem with the both sidesism. So here they come in and they're like, authorities put the blame for Hannibal Lecter's murder spree on the serial killer himself. But it takes two to tango. If it wasn't for the victims' delicious flesh, they'd probably still be alive today. Right? The second one's a little bit more about victim blaming. So the problem with both sidesism is you're still left trying to interpret, but you're trying to interpret without context. So that's another sort of kind of problem that we need to think about and talk about when we're talking with kids about information and how information works. Because it's not so simple as, here's information and it's true. Or you have to evaluate it for bias. Because there's a lot of different ways that bias plays out. You have to think about confirmation bias. You have to think about how it's framed and what the context is, particularly around both sidesism. You have to talk about what you can see with your eyes. Because people's experience is going to guide a lot of what their interpretation of, or their perception of the world around them is. So that's, now this is where I'm gonna go, yeah, you'll see. We also have to think about the power of who's creating that information. So power structures exist. They've existed for a long time. They're invisible. We live in their water. And so we don't always necessarily see the way power structure works. So how many of you know who Harriet Jacobs is? Oh, we've got one. Good. So Frederick Douglass. How many people know who Frederick Douglass is? OK, same thing. Harriet Douglass. Harriet Jacobs was a slave girl. She wrote a memoir. It's probably not as well crafted as Frederick Douglass, right? She lived in hiding for years so that she could still see her children as a slave. And it's a really powerful thing. She's also a woman, right? So the power there and who gets attention. And when it comes to Frederick Douglass in particular, dude, he's cool, right? He's awesome. His ability to stay friends with Susan B. Anthony post deal around the who got voting rights, black men or white women, really cool guy, honestly. But still, there's a thing there. Who gets the power? In this case, it just happens to be male, right? Because we do have sort of a sexist structure in our society. You're not going to convince me otherwise. On the upper right hand, those are California Indians. And below them is Father Junipero Serra. We just finally started dealing with this in California, where we finally went after the mission system in California, right? But they weren't like the most benevolent people. They were running slaves with the Native Americans. Not to mention they stole their land. We are colonizers. We're not immigrants, unless you're, some of you in here, but we're colonizers. I am a colonizer, all the way back too. So the way we told the stories in our history books and all those things, that's information that we're giving our kids, and we're just now starting to deal with that information in California. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, like, she was as important to that movement as he was. We still know, we have a Cesar Chavez Day. Of course, he's dead and she's not. That has something to do with it. But, there's some of that in that sort of thing. And the other thing is that we don't really talk a lot about the way the Chinese contributed to building our country, right? And yet they did. And there's all this racism around it, right? This right here is an image from a history textbook. And I'm sure that's supposed to be about propaganda, but come on, right? And so who has the power to give information, particularly in our schools via textbooks? That's huge. And it changes the way we have to think about what information literacy is, because we have to come back to how are they getting and who has the power to do this. I told you I was going to get political. It just is. And let's keep going on that, right? So literacy is about power too. It has been from the very get-go. I'm being live streamed, so this isn't going to be as obvious to them, but I have a tattoo. On my arm, it says Liber, and it's an open book. It's the root word for library. It's also the root word for liberty, because reading makes you free. And we knew that way back with the Greeks and the Romans, right? And so every time we have some kind of new technology that delivers information to the masses, there's backlash. The printing press. We can't print a lot of books out there because everybody's going to learn how to read, and then we're not going to be able to maintain our power. And then we started printing cheap books. Oh my God. Those things, we can't have them in the library. They're not good enough, right? Libraries, by the way, not neutral spaces and all about maintaining power. We like to think we're not, but when we start these sorts of comments, like, can't have Goosebumps in the library, it's not good enough reading for my kids. And I know that nobody in here does that. Right?
Right.
Okay, but that's the thing. So power is also part of it, but it's also context, right? So how we see something, interpret something, often depends on the context in which we exist. So political cartoon. You have, my partner here is from Oregon. She should recognize these people. You have the people who busted in, it wasn't Baker, Oregon. Anyways, took over the BLM land and, right? And then got off, right? They were protesters. Black Lives Matter, certain media outlets, they're thugs, right? Really coded language there, by the way. So the context of how we promote something in terms of literacy has to take into account. You have to say, what is the context of what I'm learning here? And how does that work? And as a side note, well, actually not as a side note, because that's where I'm going. The problem with that is, I love it when I'm like, I think I'm going to go off topic, and then I'm like, oh no, I'm really still on topic. Isn't that great? So the problem with all of that is, with context, is then we all end up fighting over what literacy is. Everybody wants a piece of the literacy pie because there's only so many resources to go around. Now, Delane was on fire this morning, and her point was there shouldn't be so much resources, so only so many resources to go around, right? There should be the resources. Like Delane goes on fire every once in a while. It's kind of delightful. Alan November had a little bit of a different piece. By the way, the thing about Harvard, the expert blind spot he was talking about with Harvard, confirmation bias is in play there too. So, but in the real world, we only have so many resources to go around. So everybody wants a little bit of the literacy pie, because if they get that, then they have the resources. So we have things like digital literacy and information literacy and media literacy and critical literacy, not to mention scientific and mathematic and basic. And now we have social emotional and financial. Like, all of that stuff is really, really important. I'm not arguing that it's not important. I would say digital media and information literacy could probably merge into one concept. I also say I think information literacy should be the Uber literacy, because information is underlying everything. Even basic literacy, reading and writing, you do that to get and share information. You can't do information literacy without reading and writing, but you can't do reading and writing without information. And I don't care whether it's art or poetry or like anything like that. I mean, so that's a thing. But look, this is what our world looks like when we start talking about literacy and education in particular, right? So this is the problem with context. We have to break those walls down. It shouldn't be little stop signs all over the place. It should be one big sort of integrated map of messiness when we're talking about what literacy is and how context works. So this idea of what we're going to teach information literacy, it shouldn't be that simple, because information is not that simple. And assuming, right, that we know what information is sort of ignores the idea that information can be a lot of things. It can be not true. It can be like emotional, and therefore people are going to respond to it differently, right? Like something that I find super exciting and makes me happy is not going to be the same thing for somebody else. And the point about that is you discard. If it's not interesting, you only have so much brain space. So if it's not interesting, you stop thinking about it, right? You just are like, whatever, I don't care. So this all comes down to this idea of, wow, what do we do, right? Like, how are we going to approach this? What are we going to do about information literacy? So, obviously my first point about all of this is one of the things that we should do is we should problematize information. Maybe not to our students until we're ready to figure out how to work with them on that, but we should problematize information. So we end up with something that looks like this as an information literacy framework. Now, this is ACRL, it's not AASL. Partially that's because AASL standards have moved away from information literacy. Backstory, that's political. They had to. They had to rename their standards something other than information power. And so therefore they ended up moving a little away from information literacy. So it is information literacy. You look, they use inquiry a lot now. But when you look at it, it is information literacy, but they have moved away. I pulled the ACRL standards because they have this thing called threshold concepts. And the idea there is that when you meet the threshold, then you start to move into a different status of understanding. And so they have these types of things. And I wanted to pull this out because of this notion of understanding that authority is constructed and contextual, which is what I've been standing up here saying about information, that it's constructed and contextual. But if authority is constructed and contextual, who has the authority? What is truth? Who's seeing the big picture, right? And how do you bring that together? How do you synthesize in all of that? And that is our challenge. Because we've been telling kids they have to evaluate information. We've been talking about bias. Who's left to give them, how do they start to determine authority, and what are the strategies that they can use to do that? And this is where I'm going to say, I wanted you to walk away with questions, not answers, because I don't have that answer. I have some ideas, but I don't have that answer. So it's not as simple as like, okay, I got it, I'm going to walk away and I get this now. But there are some things that we've talked about in our profession consistently all the way along. One of them is this idea of critical thinking. So critical thinking is just the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Really lovely. I'm pretty sure that when it comes to climate change, there's a lot of policymakers out there who think that they've thought critically about climate change. And because we are now, Eureka's gonna get snow! Ryan, Eureka's gonna get snow! Right? Like, that never happens. I've lived up there for 20 years and I think I've seen it once. So we've got any number of policy people, including the dude at the top, who are like, well, it can't be global warming, missing the whole concept of climate change, who will believe the 3% of scientists who are still like, well, maybe humans don't have too much to do with climate change, who misunderstand the way the scientific process works, and they think they've come up with a solution. So there's some problems with critical thinking, right? That comes back to the same sorts of things around judgment. And then you have Calvin, who's like, it's complicating my life, so I'm not going to do it. And I know we all have Calvins in our classes, right? It's like, I'm not going to do it. So we talk about tools that we use to help making teaching easier. Sure. Yeah, I know, it's so bad back there. So I read this library book you got me. What'd you think of it? It really made me see things differently. It's given me a lot to think about. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's complicating my life. Don't give me any more. We don't want to complicate anybody's life, right? So we talk about tools. This is from, God, I'm sorry about the lighting on this. I should have changed my things. This is from Columbia School of Journalism. It's about who owns what, and it's media companies. So in 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 companies. That's a diversity of opinions and ideas. In 2011, and it's gotten kind of worse, 90% is controlled by 6 companies. Those companies are GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. I have a book coming out and I want to promote it. I'm going to go on Good Morning America. Same company owns the publisher, owns the TV station. So you get that sort of thing, right? And then you have things like Sinclair, who just basically go out and say to their news reporters, this is what you're going to do. And I live in rural America, so I'm intimately familiar with Sinclair, because they're buying up those small town stations like nobody's business, because you can't afford to make media anymore. So I think actually part of this is helping kids be aware of how the media companies work in terms of where they're getting their information, and adults. in terms of where they're getting their information, so they can see the synergies and the connections between how information is put forward, and therefore look for diversity of thought. The type of diversity of thought we might have had in 1983, ignoring the power structures that were in play in 1983. I ruined Hoosiers for my husband the other night. I was in very big trouble by doing a race analysis. Anyway, so this is one thing that is kind of out there that you can think about and how to use, and in terms of that. You have to be careful, right? Because we don't want to be like, well, you can't trust the media, right? Because that is one of the places where we're getting our information. And you have to be conscious too about the difference between opinion and news, because that's not happening much anymore. Even your straight news stories have analysis in them. And then you get Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, right? They're not news, they're opinions. And don't get me wrong, Rachel Maddow can, if you want to teach how to craft and synthesize an argument, Maddow is the best in the business at it, hands down. In terms of taking a lot of different information and synthesizing an argument together, holy moly, she's great at it. That's still her opinion that she's crafting. So that's one sort of tool, is to kind of look at how that works. Another one, and you guys have all seen this and it keeps getting better, but I still have some questions about it, is this media-like thing about where media places fall on the thing, right? So, sorry, I'm checking my time. Okay, I have lots of time. So where media plays and falls on the thing. So I don't, where was the one that I was kind of questioning the other day? I was looking at it and I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. Anyways, let me just kind of give you what it is down here. So this is the extreme left. This is the extreme right. And then this is basically what the kind of, if they're opinion, fair persuasion, if they do selective or incomplete, propaganda, misleading information, they're down here. So InfoWars, who I'm more familiar with because we go to sleep listening to Coast, which I call the crazies. I don't know if you guys know Coast to Coast. You started out with Alan Bell, who did UFOs, right? Now it's something else entirely. And I can only go to sleep with it if they're not doing politics, because on more than one occasion, I've woken my husband from a dead sleep to insist that he turn off the radio because I'm so pissed off. My blood pressure has risen and I can't go to sleep. The other night it was gun control and I almost lost my mind. And I was like, you have to turn this off. And he was like, I was like, just put sports on. Why? Of course, I couldn't listen to sports after the Patriots won the Super Bowl either because I had the same problem. Anyway, so I know about InfoWars from Coast to Coast because Alex Jones used to go on Coast to Coast all the time. And he pushes so many conspiracy theories that he finally got sued by the parents of Sandy Hook victims, who said that because he was going around telling everybody it was a false flag operation and that the U.S. government did it in order to have gun control. That worked out well. Ask the kids of Parkland how well that worked out. I mean, this is a conspiracy. It's not even true. And like, you've got these poor parents who lost their 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Anyway, so you have that, right? That's that lower thing. And then you have kind of the original fact reporting and where they're more fair, kind of towards the top, less analysis. That's where you're going to find things like AP that had the both siderisms, right? Where like AP and Reuters are trying to do real fact-based sort of things. You're going to find them, AP's right now, up at the top, neutral, right? Both sides, got to have both sides. You know what's not in there? I just realized is Christian Science Monitor.
Oh, yes, it is there.
Where is it?
It's slightly to the right and in the middle.
Okay. I had some issues with their reporting in 2016, and my father and I had a big argument about it. So anyways, I know the one that Drudge Report is right here, which is like slightly to the right with a fair interpretation of the news. I got problems with that. I'm not buying that with the Drudge Report at all. So, I mean, there's some problems here, but it's also one of the things that's nice about this is not all of those are owned by those 6 media conglomerations. So when you're talking about ways to look for diversity of thought, here's a good place that kids can go and look at it. So she's not here, but I want to give a real shout out to a colleague of mine who talks about this stuff a lot and has made me think about this a lot. And oh my God, I'm so sorry. I lost her name. Tasha, thank you. Tasha Burks Michelson works at Castellea and talks about source literacy, right? Talks about using things like Alex Jones and going deep. Like, what's the point? Her kids actually use Russian Times sometimes to go deep because it helps kind of spread out the idea. So I'm going to go back to the elephant. I said to remind me if I didn't go back to the elephant. I'm going to go back to the elephant. The trick there is to put all 6 of those guys, the trunk and the tail and the legs and the tusks and all of that, put it all together, the body, so that you have a big picture. We have to go deep. If we're teaching research and information literacy, we have to go deep. That's why source literacy matters. And part of source literacy is the who owns what, right? But part of it, I mean, that's part of the thing around Russian Times, is if going deep on that gives kids sort of a context, that piece that they need, the context of why would this be this way for this? But they can't just rely on that one thing. I know we all say 3 sources. I don't think kids get why we say 3 sources. And hopefully we're changing that a little bit. But like, you have to explain why multiple sources. Synthesis, okay, so here's the problem with Bloom's taxonomy. Evaluation is like up above synthesis. Synthesis is the hardest thing we'll do. It's the hardest thing we'll do. And it's also the hardest thing to teach, right? It's so hard to teach synthesis. But that's a key part of research and information literacy. They have to go deep. They need information from any number of sources that they can get from, right? So it's not just about like, oh, we just need to, and they need to challenge it. So like if they're getting one piece of information, they need to look to see if there's other places that information is not the same. They have to lean in to their confirmation bias, to use the Sheryl Sandberg thing, right? They have to lean into that. They have to be uncomfortable. They don't like that. Nobody likes it. It sucks. I want to have this, I want to know this. I want to be comfortable in what I'm learning. So we need to make them uncomfortable. That's important, and they have to lean into that, but they have to go deep. Yesterday, Shelley and I did our inquiry learning thing, and I was talking about time. I know. You guys have one-offs. They come in. You're lucky if you've got them for multiple days. Those days tend to be back-to-back. If we're going to really do this, I can't imagine that one-offs are going to work. I just can't. Oh, we have to go deep. They need time. This stuff takes time. And I think that's probably one of the biggest and most difficult and critical things that we have to deal with, is the structure of school. They're really good at doing school. Even if they don't do it, doesn't mean that they're not good at it. They've learned how to do school, right? Tell me what to think. Give it to me. Give me the easy way. Where's the rubric? All of you, my students who still have me right now, are like, oh, that's why she doesn't have rubrics in her class anymore. I hate rubrics. I'm just sorry. But they all want that, you know? And I don't blame them. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of freaking pressure on these kids, right? Do well. Get into a good school. Go forward. Or maybe, you know, do well and be prepped to go to, you know, into a job. Like, there's a lot of pressure on these kids. So, you know, not easy. It just isn't. I don't know what to tell you, right? I'm like, hey, go forth. Fix my problem for me. Figure out how to teach information literacy. You know, and that's probably not a totally fair thing to do, but you know, that's kind of the thing. But one of the things I think, you know, like laying bare those structures are really important and making kids uncomfortable and going deep. And you know, that's hard to do all of that. So, Tasha, if you're watching, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. Just up here. Do you have questions, comments? You're crazy. Really? Yes.
For the invitation for us to change
The-
perceptions about Find the Box and offer this country.
So she was talking, thank you for the compliment. She was saying, I'm repeating because of the live stream, that she appreciated the idea of changing the conversation and you know, shifting all of that.
My thing is that I don't think it's being taught outside of us.
The library.
I really don't, and it's because teachers don't have. I was in the classroom, I'm not going to do it. And you, like, part of the standards to have this research project done. How are you even going to get the kids started? And not to mention, most of the schools in my district don't even have a teacher librarian. So I just don't think it's being done.
That was Dana's point about media literacy.
Yeah.
She's right on both the media literacy, and you're right on the information literacy. It was, you wrote for me, right? Yeah, it's not being done. But that was, you know, part of what she was trying to get at, is it's not being done. If we're gonna do it, we gotta do it better. We can't just say, let's teach information literacy, let's do media literacy, because it's not being done. I forgot you wrote for me. The reason this is happening is because somebody contacted me after that exchange in the journal and said this should be a CSLA presentation. So, yeah, so the first time I saw Alan November speak was at a CSLA conference when I was a newbie. So that would have been late 1990s, early 2000s, I guess. So it was one of those way back when I was in. And he was basically talking about blowing up the paradigm of school. And I've never forgotten it, because honestly, I was like, oh man, wouldn't that be delightful if you could change the way. So I mean, this is another structural problem that we're facing, right? Is that there's still high stakes testing. There's still siloed teachers. Not so much in elementary school. I know I tend to talk high school. Not so much in elementary school, but they still have some of that pressure too, right? In fact, elementary school actually probably does this stuff a lot better than middle and high school, because you get to middle and high school and you hit siloed subject areas and you hit high stakes testing and lots of pressure, and it's hard, because how do you break down those walls? How do you make sure that you're collaborating and team teaching towards learning, right? Like, an information literate person is someone who's learned how to learn. How do we get there, right? So you take the test and they forget everything and they walked away. That's not learning. So how do we break all of that? And that's why I'm saying it's hard. I don't have the answers to that, because I know what the solution is in my head, which is to throw out content standards. Just throw out content standards, right? That's the solution in my head. Process standards. If we have to have standards, process standards. That's not going to happen, because of the power structure that is there has decided what's important to learn, right? So that's why I said I don't have answers. I'm going to have you walking away with questions. But I want you thinking about it. Jeff?
I think the key is where you started with this, that there isn't necessarily an answer. And for our role as teacher librarians is to pose the same questions to our classroom teachers, because until that paradigm changes in my classroom, my castle, my fiefdom, if the question is understood at the classroom level, that there is a question, because right now, you know, here's a new textbook adoption. Oh, great,
Yeah.
new authority. But what is that
Authority.
Putting that in the context, and that question of that context in front of the teacher, so if they're asking the same questions we are, then there becomes a more relevance for the library and the resources and the information pieces that we can provide to the students and the classrooms. I mean, I think it's not just about focusing on the kids. I think our
Right.
role as professional developers
So-
really plays in here.
Excellent point, right? Getting the teachers to ask these questions, asking the teachers of these questions. You know, one of the things Alan, November, was talking about today is the ability of teachers to give up control. Sometimes that's hard, right? That authority control. And that first grade teacher that he was talking about, what he loved about her is that she's like, oh, we're going to learn how to make a video camera and you can YouTube it, you know, that sort of thing. But that is a really hard thing to do. But if we can get our teachers to ask that question, to challenge that, then maybe we can start shifting the paradigm. So 2 things about this. Yesterday, I heard this amazing suggestion that I'm going to share with you now, and then I'm going to continue to share over and over with my classes. And that is putting essential questions up in your library. Setting the idea of questioning at the heart of your school, right? She's back there, not my idea. Really great idea, right? So you start this concept of we're gonna ask questions all the time. The second thing is I have a friend, and those of you who know me are gonna know who this person is, but that's okay. I have this friend who is doing exactly what Jeff was just talking about, which is trying to upend this sort of notion of power and authority and information in her English classroom. So we have spent weeks on end talking about whether or not you teach the canon, specifically whether or not you teach Huckleberry Finn. I live in the Great White North. There's it's growing, but it's definitely less than 1% African American at her school site. And in that particular class, she's got 1. And that girl feels it. She wrote an amazing piece for the school newspaper about what it was like to be that big of a minority on campus and the use of the N-word. And she feels it, right? And nobody wants her to do the emotional labor for all the white kids in the class. So she's struggling with this concept of it. And so what she's trying to do is use it to upend the authority and to get kids to do the questioning themselves, to not be told what to think about something, to really kind of dive in and do the questioning yourself. And that's where I was talking about kids being uncomfortable. Boy, I get it every other day. Yesterday it was a great day. The day before, it was these kids, they hate me, they hate this, they're so unhappy, and they're uncomfortable because she's not telling them what to do. And they can't read Spark Notes, right? Everybody else on campus is like, I'm not going to read the book, I'm just going to read Spark Notes, and their Spark Notes is going to tell me the questions that the teacher's going to ask. So if you can get teachers to do that like she's doing, right? And it took me years to get her there, and I didn't do it all by myself because Columbia is helping a little bit. But if you can get teachers to ask that question and dive in, then you can start really dealing with what information literacy is. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm an English teacher and I'm a second semester student at SJS
Okay.
in high school. And everything you were saying about critical thinking and critical literacy and understanding power structures and understanding confirmation bias, I was like, yes, 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 yes. And then you were like, that's why I don't use rubrics. I was like, what?
That's not why I don't use rubrics. I don't use rubrics because I find them constraining and that I feel like they grade the product, not the learning. That's why I don't use rubrics. But go on.
I was just, I think, could you say a little bit more about then the way that you, because again, there's always confirmation bias. We've always got, our students who are like, oh, you can do no wrong. We've always got students who are more critical of than others. How do you think that is a good way to, authentically and equitably, understand student learning?
Reflection helps. That's one way. Giving up the idea that you can gauge how much somebody's learned helps, right? I should probably not be saying this because you are going to have me for 3 classes. At some point in time, you're going to run across me. But that's okay. I do a lot of reflection because that's really what I'm interested in, is what you think you learned. So I think that helps. And I also think, I mean, this is one of the things that my friend and I talk about a lot, why she's kind of struggling with this, right? Is that she just has acknowledged that what she thought learning was before, they probably weren't really. And so she's not sure what it looks like now. She's just trying to find it and figure it out. And I would say that's true of what I do too. Like, you know, it's hard to tell sometimes. It really is. But I do think reflection helps a lot, right? So like those little first graders, this is what learning looks like, and this is what I'm excited about, and that's what they did. Like, if you can find a way to move that in somehow, you know, I think that's what you have to do. I do think we do need to, here's the thing. You need a product for assessment and accountability. And you're accountable. You just are. I meant to send it to Shelley today. I saw something about giving up on grades. But you're accountable, you really are. And you probably should be, because I've seen a lot of bad teachers. So, but we don't have a system to deal with it. We do, but I don't know a single administrator that will. Anyway, so you have that, right? You have to do that. So you have to have a product in order to do it. But learning is here. It's here, you know, and so that I think is really hard. I don't have the answers.
I'm sorry, I don't want to take up
No.
the conversation, but just the other piece of that is how do we make that explicit for students? Because a lot of times I have these conversations with my students where they're like, why did you give me this grade? And I'm like, you earned this grade, and these are the standards, you know, this is what I'm thinking about. Because I think I don't want, talking about shifting the power structures, I don't want the kids to see me as being like this godlike figure that like has the answers and like bestows on them, you learned this. Like, how can they see for themselves, this is the progress that I'm making, this is what I figured out.
When's your session?
My session. On Saturday. Why are you putting me on the spot?
So Anthony is going to do a thing on digital portfolios. And the reason why I bring that up is because making students responsible for their own meeting of their benchmarks and standards and seeing how they fit is one way you can do that. So have them grade it. Have them say, this is how it meets the standard, right? The other thing that I'm seeing, you said English teacher, so the other thing, and this is about making students uncomfortable, but it turns out it's working really well. My friend, the English teacher, if it doesn't meet the requirements, she hands it back to them without a grade on it, and it stays a 0 until they redo it. It doesn't mean they get an A when they do redo it, but she's like, nope. And she'll give it comments. If they only respond to the proofreading comments and not the content comments, and it's the first thing she looks for, it goes right back again. So they've learned to do it right the first time. Took a while. But she said to me yesterday, these two kids who've only ever been interested in the 2.0 because they want to play sports, these two kids are working their asses off right now because they want to get it right the first time. They don't want to have to keep redoing it. So anyway, that's why I put you on the spot. I also put you on the spot because I have faith in you. I know you're going to rock it. Any other questions? Comments? Okay, that's popped up. So, that's my book. Just came out in December, The Girl Positive Library. It's basically about reading YA literature as a feminist. There's words like intersectionality, power structures, privilege, etc. in it. I do this whole thing about how I basically screwed on the trans stuff, and I'm really sorry, and I apologize. There's a thing in there about TERFs, if you don't know what that is, trans exclusionary radical feminism. I mean, it's me, so there it is. But it's also got a lot of reviews of books for girls in there that are kind of coming at it from that angle. That's the other hat that I wear. right, is that piece. My email address is my name, Marianne, M-A-R-Y.A-N-N, or sorry, Marianne, M-A-R-Y-A-N-N dot Harlan, H-A-R-L-A-N, and at sjsu.edu. Because you probably can't say that. I'm going to put Anthony on the spot again. My Twitter is Marianne Harlan, all one word. It is not safe for work. I like the F word. I use the F word. I'm not using it now because I'm streaming, but it's a thing for me. And I follow a lot of people who are that way, and I retweet them. And so it's not safe for work. Do not retweet me from your work account. I learned that last semester. I think it's lovely. But anyways, because of that, I have now started adding the NSFW behind it. And I'm an occasional tweeter, but you can always get me there. So I'm much more of a lurker.
And I'd like to put in a shameless plug for your book and say I started reading it last night, Marianne. It was just gifted to me yesterday. Thank you. And despite the fact it has some really fancy vocabulary in it, it is really easy to read, and it goes down so nicely. Like, I was just so enjoying your writing style and the content, which is a twofer, and that makes for a really enjoyable reading experience. So, well done.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. If you come up with any amazing ideas, let me know. And I was glad to have you here.
Please give me the source for the grid about the video. Please.
Yes, I can. I hesitated because I'm not sure it's on the slide.